There are nights in London when the wind itself seems to carry secrets, when the fog hangs low and yellow over the lamps, and the city feels like a great cathedral whose prayers have gone unanswered. It was during one such winter that Holmes and I found ourselves drawn into a case unlike any other, a matter not of theft or murder, but of fire, a fire that lived upon the page. It began with a letter from Surrey, speaking of a family chapel, an old psalter, and a strange blasphemy of nature. At each recitation of a certain psalm, the book would smoulder and burn as though the words themselves had turned against the reader. The servants called it a curse, the villagers whispered of judgment, but Holmes, with his customary disdain for the supernatural, declared that there was more chemistry than damnation in the affair. Yet as we travelled to Ashwood Hall, through the fog and the frost, even I could not shake the feeling that some darker hand had kindled the flame. What we found there, a family divided, a legacy at stake, and a crime disguised as miracle, proved that sin can hide behind the cross as easily as behind the knife. This, then, is the case I have titled Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Burning Psalter. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice, and if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Bell at Baker Street. It was a raw forenoon in early February when the bell announced the arrival of two persons whose contrast was as striking as their urgency. The frost had laid its white hand upon London throughout the night, and now the city breathed out fog like a consumptive patient. Thick, yellow, and clinging to the window panes of our Baker Street lodgings with the persistence of an unwelcome creditor. I had been occupied with the morning's correspondence, sorting through the usual appeals for medical consultations and the occasional request for my companion's services, when the sharp peal of the bell brought Mrs. Hudson's footsteps hurrying up the 17 steps to our sitting-room. The first visitor was a gentleman of clerical bearing, spare, parchment-faced, with that orderliness of dress which clings to men who have spent their lives among ledgers or liturgies. His coat, though well brushed, showed the threadbare quality of honest poverty, and his collar possessed that particular crispness which speaks of a housekeeper who takes pride in small economies. The second, a young lady whose travelling cloak could not disguise the stateliness of her carriage, nor quite conceal the tremor of distress that set her gloved hands quivering upon the muff she carried. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the clergyman began, bowing in our doorway with an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to bring a breath of the countryside into our urban chambers. "I am the Reverend Elias Brent, chaplain to Ashwood Chapel near Godalming. This is Miss Clara Ashwood, niece to Lady Eugenia Ashwood of Ashwood Hall. We are in grievous need, sir, and have travelled since before dawn to lay our case before you." Holmes, who had been at the violin, he was rendering a bleak little air of Schumann with a concentration that made the fire burn jealous, laid the instrument across the chair arm with that peculiar gentleness he reserved for his Stradivarius, and indicated seats with a courteous gesture which never failed him, however irregular the hour or unexpected the visitor. I observed our guests as they settled themselves. The young lady, whom I judged to be perhaps 25, possessed that quality of controlled distress which marks those accustomed to bearing burdens privately. Her features, though drawn with anxiety, were handsome in the manner of old family portraits. A long, intelligent face, with hazel eyes, that met one's gaze directly. The Reverend, meanwhile, had the look of a man who has passed several sleepless nights in succession. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of more than mere fatigue. "You have come from Surrey since dawn," said Holmes as he set the coffee tray between them with his own hands, a courtesy he extended only to those whose distress struck him as genuine. "Your cloak, madam, is spattered with the fine chalk of the Godalming Road, and the Reverend's sleeve bears candle grease recently set. See how it rims, but does not penetrate the cloth. You travelled in haste and by carriage. The marks of the rug strap on your wrist betray the movement of a gallop. The roads are icy this morning, yet you risked a rapid journey. Your business, therefore, admits no delay." Miss Ashwood's eyes, hazel and proud despite their redness, grew wide with that mixture of alarm and relief which I had seen so often in those who first encountered my friend's peculiar gifts. She glanced at her wrist, where indeed the leather strap had left its telltale impression, and then at the Reverend, who nodded as if some private debate between them had been settled. "Then you will also see, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "that we are frightened beyond modesty to confess. The book is burning again." "The book?" I repeated, setting down my own cup with rather more force than I had intended. "The Ashwood Psalter," put in the Reverend, husky with anxiety. He leaned forward in his chair, his long fingers knotting together. "For centuries it has lain upon a lectern in our family chapel, though I must correct myself. It is not itself ancient, but a simple 19th century reprint bound in calf, replacing an older volume lost in a house fire of 1820. It is sacred by custom, Mr. Holmes, not by antiquity. Thrice in as many weeks, when the thurifer lights the candles for matins, and I open to Psalm the 141st, let my prayer be set forth in thy sight as the incense. A smoulder begins at the margin and spreads along the verse, as though the very words would consume themselves. We have doused it each time, but the scarring grows. And," he faltered, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the household talks of a judgment, of a curse." The room had grown very still. Beyond our windows, the fog pressed like a living thing, muffling the ordinary sounds of Baker Street, the rattle of cabs, the cries of vendors, the perpetual hum of London's vast machinery. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers templed before his face, his grey eyes bright in that peculiar inward way that meant his mind had leapt 3 moves ahead of the narrative. "A burning that selects a page," he murmured, and I detected in his tone that note of satisfaction which indicated a problem of genuine interest. "And always at Psalm 141. Why always that one, Miss Ashwood? Surely a supernatural agency would be less discriminating in its appetites." Miss Ashwood drew a breath, as if steadying herself before a difficult fence. I can scarcely say with certainty, Mr. Holmes. It is the psalm my uncle, Sir Alistair Ashwood, most loved. He would have it read at every service, and often sat in the chapel alone, with the book open to that very page. He died last Michaelmas, and since then the hall has been," she searched for the word, "unquiet. We had a quarrel in the family, sir, regarding a codicil to heir. His will, a codicil he was wont to write in the margins of his books and to have witnessed by the chaplain. The formal will was read, but this particular codicil, the final expression of his wishes, could not be found. But rumour, Oh, these poisonous country rumours! Has it he hid his final wish in the Psalter itself? Holmes's glance flitted to the hearth, where the coals glowed with a steady domestic warmth, then to the window, where the fog pressed like a grey cloth against the glass. Outside, I could hear the muffled clip-clop of a horse passing, the jingle of harness brass, and the distant call of a muffin man, the ordinary sounds of London morning rendered strange and remote by the fog's acoustic dampening. "Pray proceed," said Holmes quietly. "I perceive there is more." "The servants will not cross the chapel after sundown," said Brent, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "They whisper of judgment, of Sir Alister's spirit returning to destroy what was written. Yesterday the smoulder rose again, more fierce than before, consuming nearly half the page before we could douse it with sand. We fear the thing will burn wholly, and with it, perhaps, the last instrument by which justice might be restored to—" He stopped, his clerical training warring with his evident distress. Miss Ashwood, with a sudden flush that brought colour to her pale cheeks, continued steadily, turning to address me directly. "To me, Doctor," she said. "If my uncle's codicil spoke as he spoke to me in his final weeks, when he held my hand and told me the hall should be mine, that I alone had shown the devotion a daughter might have shown, then the estate should fall to my name. But if no such writing can be shown, the estate passes entirely to my cousin, Mr. Julian Vale. He is the present master in all but probate, and has already begun to speak of improvements, which is to say, changes that would erase my uncle's memory entirely." There was a bitterness in her final words that spoke of deeper wounds than mere inheritance could explain. Holmes's lip twitched at the word smoulder, a tick I had learned to recognize as indicating some avenue of thought had opened before him. "You have brought the book?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. "It lies in the chapel, as it ever has," the chaplain replied. "To remove it would be a profanation in the eyes of the household. Even Lady Eugenia, Sir Alister's widow, dare not suggest its removal. The servants would revolt, Mr. Holmes. They see the burning as a sign, and to remove the book would be to admit defeat before whatever force opposes us." Holmes rose with that sudden decision which irresistibly carried men in his wake, his whole frame animated by the prospect of action. "Then," said he, reaching for his coat from the peg beside the fireplace, "we shall go to Ashwood at once. Watson, your coat and your revolver, if you please. Bring also your medical bag. One never knows what emergencies the countryside may present. I think, if the fog will do us the kindness to thin as we travel southward, we may learn before dusk whether this judgment burns upon the tongue of superstition or of phosphorus." It was characteristic of my friend that, in the very utterance of that final word, the case had taken on for him an outline firm and almost cheerful. The haunted chapel, the burning scripture, the family curse, all these Gothic trappings had been translated in an instant into the vocabulary of the laboratory. For my part, I confess the notion of sacred words, kindling of their own accord, sat ill upon the nerves. Yet I have seen too many of Holmes's little demonstrations. The tobacco ash identified by its peculiar grey tint, the typewriter fonts distinguished by their microscopic irregularities, the boot prints that told the story of a man's profession and prospects, to fear a devil where a laboratory demonstration would suffice. Within 20 minutes we had secured a hansom and were rattling through the fog-bound streets toward Waterloo Station. The interior of the cab smelled of damp leather and old tobacco, and through the small window I could glimpse the yellow blur of gas lamps marking our progress through the grey soup of the London morning. Holmes sat in that attitude of coiled stillness which indicated intense mental activity, his fingers drumming occasionally upon his knee. "You observed the wrist mark," I ventured, "and the chalk dust, and the candle grease, yes. But more significant, Watson, was what they didn't bring. No letter of introduction, no prior telegram. They came on impulse, or rather on desperation. The Reverend's sermon book in his pocket shows fresh ink stains. He was writing this morning before dawn and set down his pen only to make this journey. Miss Ashwood's gloves are of good quality, but have been turned. See how the seam sits awkwardly at the thumb. Economy practiced by one accustomed to better circumstances. An estate in dispute, a household in decay, and now a mystery that threatens to consume the very evidence that might resolve it. Really, Watson, it promises to be most engaging." The train journey to Godalming passed in that peculiar suspension of time which railway travel induces. Holmes read through a sheaf of chemical journals he had brought, occasionally making annotations in his pocketbook, while I watched the winter countryside slide past our window. Bare trees etched against grey sky, fields of stubble furred with frost, and here and there the smoke of a cottage chimney rising straight and white in the still air. Miss Ashwood and the Reverend sat in the compartment opposite, speaking in low tones, and I observed how the young lady's composure seemed to falter now that the immediate crisis of securing Holmes's aid had passed. Once I saw her press a handkerchief to her eyes, and the Reverend's hand upon her arm was gentle with a pastoral solicitude that spoke well of his character. It was mid-afternoon when we reached Ashwood, approaching by a hired trap along roads that wound through that particular landscape of Surrey heath and woodland. With that half-hopeful, half-dreadful tension which only a new investigation can induce, I followed Holmes down from the trap, my medical bag in one hand and my stick in the other, as the afternoon light, thin and grey as gruel, fell upon Ashwood Hall. Thus our quiet morning dissolved, and the most curious conflagration of that winter began to warm its hands at our heels. Chapter 2. Ashwood Hall and the First Embers. We reached Ashwood under a sky of lead, with a wind that combed the cedars and made the chimneys mutter like old men in their sleep. It was one of those square, sober houses of the Hanoverian age whose plainness cannot quite suppress the suggestion of watchful eyes. Built of grey stone that had weathered to a dove-breast softness, it presented that peculiar combination of solidity and melancholy which characterizes houses that have seen much and spoken little. The long approach, flanked by yews tortured into unnatural shapes by generations of topiary shears and crusted with hoar-frost that glittered like salt, led us to a portico beneath which a groom took our modest luggage, and a butler, Mr. Cobbett, as we soon learned, bowed us into the great hall with a practised deference that could not quite mask his evident relief at our arrival. Holmes's first sweep of the eye told him much, and I, who had learned something of his methods, found myself automatically cataloguing the details of our surroundings. The great hall was panelled in oak that had darkened to the colour of strong tea, and the air held that peculiar scent of old houses, beeswax and lavender, and something else, something acrid that made my nostrils flare. The drift of ash beneath the sconces suggested candles burned for longer than was strictly economical, and the polished brass of a lamp left too close to the panelling bore a discoloured patch where heat had worked its transformation. But it was the smell which most arrested my attention, a faint, persistent odour which, though the house was large, had insinuated itself even here in the entrance hall. "Garlic," I whispered to Holmes as Cobbett took our coats. "Not quite, Watson." His nostrils flared, delicate as a hound's catching a scent. "A cousin to it. Phosphorus has a family resemblance to allium when it oxidizes, but with a sharper, more mineral quality. Someone in this house has been working with chemicals, and recently. We were presented to the household in the drawing-room, a long, well-proportioned chamber whose windows looked out upon formal gardens, now sleeping under their winter covering. Lady Eugenia Ashwood, the widow, was a woman of poise and porcelain, tall, perhaps 40 years of age, with a pale loveliness whose first bloom had been carried off by sorrow, but whose composure suggested an inner strength that adversity had tempered rather than broken. She wore black, as befitted her widowhood, but it was a black relieved by touches of grey silk that spoke of mourning's gradual accommodation to life's demands. Her hand, when I took it, was cool and steady, and her voice possessed that particular clarity which comes from disciplined emotion. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you are most welcome to Ashwood, though I confess the circumstances of your visit bring me shame. That my husband's house should require the services of a detective. It speaks to a failure of family governance that wounds me deeply." "On the contrary, Lady Eugenia," Holmes replied with a bow, "it speaks only to circumstances that would perplex the wisest Solomon. I am here to observe, not to judge." Mr. Julian Vale, the cousin and presumptive heir, offered a hand that trembled not at all, and a smile that travelled little beyond the lips. He was handsome in the fashionable manner, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and darker eyes, dressed in a morning coat that spoke of London tailors, and an attention to appearance that verged on the theatrical. Yet there was something in his manner that struck me as studied, as though he played the part of grieving cousin in residence without quite feeling the emotions the role demanded. "A detective!" he exclaimed, with that particular brightness which some men affect when they wish to appear at ease. "How absolutely thrilling! I confess, Mr. Holmes, I had thought your trade limited to murder and theft. A burning book seems rather beneath your legendary talents." "I have found, Mr. Vale," Holmes replied coolly, "that the smallest mysteries often conceal the largest crimes. A burned book may be as eloquent as a corpse, if one knows how to read it." There was also Mr. Felix Prynne, a collector of antiquarian books, touring the county, as he said, with an eager, rather intense manner, to admire private chapels and libraries. He was a thin man, with over-bright eyes, that moved constantly, taking in every detail of the room, and he carried a portfolio under his arm, which he clutched as though it contained the crown jewels. His fingers, I noted, bore the ink stains of one who writes much, and there was a nervous energy about him that spoke of a nature highly strung and perhaps unreliable. "Mr. Holmes!" Prynne exclaimed, starting forward with an enthusiasm that bordered on the intrusive. "What an extraordinary honour! I have followed your cases in the Strand magazine with the greatest interest. The matter of the blue carbuncle. Magnificent. And the speckled band. I hardly slept for a week after reading Watson's account. To think that I should encounter you here, in pursuit of what may prove to be a bibliographic mystery of the first order." Mrs. Temple, the housekeeper, completed the assembly. She was a woman of perhaps 50, stout and competent in appearance, whose nervous glances toward the chapel range corridor proclaimed a nightly tyranny of fear that had worn her nerves to threads. Her hands, clasped before her apron, showed the redness of frequent immersion in water and lye, and when she spoke, her voice carried the local accent softened by years of service in a gentleman's household. Holmes lost no time in pleasantries. "The chapel, if you please," said he, with that briskness which indicated his mind was already 3 steps ahead of the present moment. "Time and chemistry wait for no man, and I should prefer to examine the locus of our mystery while daylight remains." Proceeded Holmes and I, Miss Ashwood, the Reverend Brent, and Lady Eugenia, along a flagged corridor whose walls bore the ghostly rectangles where pictures had once hung, through a small door of ancient oak and into Ashwood Chapel itself. It was a modest, lovely place, with a nave no longer than a London drawing-room, oak pews rubbed to a satin sheen by generations of worshipful hands, and a tiny vestry whose walls held a flight of memorial tablets for men long returned to dust. The air within was cold and still, carrying that particular quality of sacred spaces, a hush that seemed to absorb sound and hold it suspended. The late afternoon light filtered through a single stained glass window, depicting King David with his harp, casting pools of coloured radiance upon the stone floor. Upon the lectern, illuminated by a shaft of ruby-red light, as though by design, lay the object of our pilgrimage, a brown, calf-bound psalter, blackened at its upper corner and warped at the foredge, as if some heat had gripped it more than once and loosed it only grudgingly. The sight of it, this humble book transformed into evidence of either supernatural malice or human cunning, sent an involuntary chill along my spine. Holmes bent over it as a physician over a fevered child, his long fingers hovering above the damaged surface without quite touching it. He produced his lens, that powerful glass which had revealed so many secrets, and subjected every inch of the book's exterior to a scrutiny so intense that I found myself holding my breath. After several minutes of this silent examination, he summoned me to note the scalloped brown of the margin along Psalm 141, the peculiar furrow where the page had curled upon itself like a living thing recoiling from flame, and the crust of fine white substance adhering to the inner hinge. "Salt," I hazarded, bending close. Holmes took out his penknife, that versatile tool which had served him in 100 investigations, and with infinite care teased a grain upon the blade, sniffed at it with the delicacy of a connoisseur sampling wine, and touched it lightly to his tongue. His face registered an expression I had seen before, satisfaction leavened with vindication. "No, but we shall have proof in a moment." From his pocket he produced a tiny glass vial, and from the vestry coal scuttle, which stood beside a small iron stove for heating the space in winter, he selected a cinder that still held some residual warmth. On a pew end, he scraped the grain carefully and held the cinder near. A faint wick of blue smoke crawled upward. Then, as the cinder's warmth kissed the powder, there came a wicked little sputter and the most delicate tongue of flame, as a candle might give at its birth, a pale, hungry flame that burned with a brightness disproportionate to its size. "Observe," said Holmes softly, his voice carrying that note of pedagogical satisfaction, which meant he was about to deliver a lecture. A compound of white phosphorus, gum arabic for binding, and a filler, starch perhaps, or fine chalk to moderate the combustion. Spread thin upon the edge and margin of a page, it will oxidize slowly when exposed to air, but given any additional warmth, the approach of a candle, the heat of a hand, even a prolonged breath, it will ignite at a temperature easily supplied by these ordinary means. The choice of Psalm 141 was not sentimental, Watson. It was intensely practical. Let my prayer be set forth in thy sight as the incense. Incense means fire, candles, heat. A thurifer swinging his censer, a reader bringing his face close to see the text in dim light. The very act of worship becomes the mechanism of destruction. The Reverend Brent crossed himself involuntarily, his face gone white as chalk. Miss Ashwood steadied herself upon the pew rail, her knuckles showing white through the fabric of her gloves. Lady Eugenia, who had accompanied us despite the cold and her evident distaste for the chapel since her husband's death, spoke with a remarkable calm that I could not help but admire. But to what end, Mr. Holmes? Why make a terror of our devotions? If this is human agency, and I confess your demonstration persuades me it must be, then what purpose drives such blasphemy? To destroy, said Holmes, turning the pages with infinite gentleness, his fingers protected by a handkerchief he had drawn from his pocket. What lies in peril of being read? See here. He indicated a spot near the inner gutter of the affected page. The inner gutter bears the faintest drag of a knife, or perhaps a razor. Someone has scraped this margin with great care, working to thin the paper until the ink bled out or became illegible. The burning would complete what the blade began, while superstition would make the house its accomplice in destroying evidence. It is quite elegant, in a thoroughly reprehensible way. Mr. Prynne, the collector, had drawn closer than courtesy allowed, his portfolio temporarily forgotten in his fascination with the damaged volume. A clever chemical trick, he breathed, his eyes bright with that peculiar intensity of the specialist encountering a novelty in his field. Such a relic would draw hands eager to examine it, scholars, collectors, the curious. Each handling would add warmth, hasten the oxidation. I do hope, Mr. Holmes, that you will permit a scholar the smallest glance at the composition of this incendiary preparation. The historical precedents for such applications are fascinating. Did you know that similar preparations were used in the theatrical productions of the last century to create the illusion of... Holmes straightened, and his tone became cordial in a way that boded mischief, cutting smoothly across Prynne's enthusiastic discourse. Later, perhaps, Mr. Prynne. For now, I should like to establish a timeline. Who first discovered the smoulder, and at what hour? Who has unrestricted access to this room when it is unoccupied? And I shall require a list of all persons who have entered this chapel since Sir Alister's death. Our circle exchanged looks, the wary glances of people suddenly made aware that they are all suspects in the eyes of the law. The housekeeper, Mrs. Temple, spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. It was me, sir, the first night. I had come to lay a posy for Sir Alister, as his lordship liked it so. Fresh flowers by the lectern every Thursday. It was my custom for 20 years. I smelled, pardon, sir, but something like a match freshly blown, that sharp scent that catches in the throat. When I turned the pages to set the marker, where his lordship preferred, at Psalm 141, A glow ran across the margin like foxfire. You know, sir, that cold light that plays upon marsh gas. I shrieked, I'm not ashamed to say it, and the Reverend came running with sand from the garden, and we smothered it quick as we could. Access? Holmes pressed, his gaze moving from face to face with that peculiar intensity which made even the innocent feel the weight of scrutiny. The vestry door is kept locked at night, said Cobbett, the butler, who had followed us to the chapel, and now stood in the doorway with that perfect servant's posture that is somehow both present and invisible. Keys are held by myself, her ladyship, and the Reverend. We keep an evening watch, sir, since the trouble began. 2 footmen, alternating every 4 hours, stationed in the corridor. Nothing has passed them. And during the day? The chapel stands open for private devotion, Lady Eugenia replied. It has always been so. My husband believed that a family chapel should be available to any member of the household who sought solace or wished to pray. Holmes's gaze had shifted to the vestry latch. He produced his lens again and examined the brass fitting with minute care. Then from the mechanism he plucked, with his tweezers, a minuscule curl of translucent skin, the kind the fingers shed in winter's dry air. He pocketed it without comment in one of the small envelopes he always carried. Then he knelt upon the cold stone floor, unmindful of the damp that would certainly mark his trousers, and peered at the floorboards of the vestry with an intensity that brought a flush of embarrassment to Lady Eugenia's pale cheeks. After a long moment, he smiled without mirth, that thin, dangerous expression which meant he had found what he sought. Boots twice resoled, he murmured, more to himself than to us. The left bears a patch-cut oblong, rather than following the natural wear pattern, an economy measure by a cobbler who valued speed over art. And here, he touched a finger to a small, pale smear upon the threshold. Wax. Beeswax. Scented, of the sort ladies buy in little cakes for their handiwork or for treating embroidery thread. Not the tallow of your altar candles, Reverend, which would be yellow and soft. This is hard, refined, commercial. Lady Eugenia's brow did not alter by so much as a hair's breadth, though I detected a slight tightening around her mouth. Many of us keep work in the afternoons by the nave fire, she said with perfect composure. I myself bring my embroidery, Miss Ashwood reads. Mr. Vale has been known to write his correspondence there. One drops a little wax, one is scolded by Mrs. Temple, and the world continues its course. Indeed, Holmes answered, rising and brushing the dust from his knees, until it doesn't. We returned to the house as the winter daylight died, that peculiar fade of February afternoon, when the grey sky simply darkens without any dramatic sunset to mark the transition. In the long drawing-room, symmetrical, tasteful, and a trifle barren in the way of rooms that are maintained but not truly lived in. Holmes took a chair at the extreme edge of the hearth-rug, positioning himself where he could observe the door, the windows, and all the occupants simultaneously. His eyes half closed, but I knew better than to think he slept. When Holmes appears most still, his mind is most in motion, cataloguing, comparing, constructing theories, and discarding them with the speed of a chess master reviewing possible gambits. I confess that the image of that treacherous little flame, licking along sacred words with a hunger quite indifferent to piety, had set my mind askew. Through the tall windows I could see the first lamps of evening beginning to wink along the drive, like a procession uncertain whether to advance or retreat. The household assembled for tea, a subdued affair during which conversation died repeatedly and had to be resuscitated by Lady Eugenia's gracious efforts. Mr. Vale attempted levity that fell flat. Mr. Prynne discoursed on ecclesiastical architecture in a manner that interested no one. And Miss Ashwood sat silent, her tea growing cold in its cup, her eyes fixed upon some private landscape of anxiety. It seemed to me that Ashwood, for all its dignity and its careful maintenance, was a house in which something had decided to burn, and would not be answered by water alone. The solution, I felt with a certainty born of long association with Holmes, would require not the fire brigade, but the clear light of reason, and that peculiar moral courage which my friend possessed in abundance, the courage to name the guilty, though heaven should fall. Chapter 3. Suspects and Apparitions. In the morning, after a breakfast during which Holmes consumed nothing but strong coffee and a single piece of dry toast, my friend and I began what he called the patient cruelty of facts. This phase of investigation, which I had witnessed in a dozen cases, consisted of systematic interrogation of every member of the household, combined with minute observation of their reactions, their evasions, and those small physical tells which betray anxiety or guilty knowledge. We spoke first with Cobbett the butler, who had served at Ashwood since boyhood, rising from hall boy to his present position over the course of 30 years. He received us in his pantry, a domain of precise order where every piece of silver knew its place, and the household accounts were kept in ledgers whose pages showed not a single blot or correction. A man of perhaps 55, with that particular dignity which long service in a good house confers, Cobbett spoke of Sir Alistair with genuine affection. "A gentleman of the old school, sir," he said to Holmes, his hands folded upon the green baize of his work-table. "Particular in his habits, but never harsh. He knew every servant by name, asked after their families, attended their weddings and their children's christenings. When my Agnes, that's my wife, sir, she's the upper housemaid, when Agnes took ill with the pneumonia 3 winters past, it was Sir Alistair himself who sent for the doctor from London and paid the fee out of his own pocket." "Yet there was a dispute regarding the will?" Holmes prompted gently. Cobbett's face clouded. "Not a dispute, sir, so much as an uncertainty. Sir Alistair was always writing notes, you see, in his books, on scraps of paper, even on his shirt cuffs when the mood took him. 'A thought must be captured when it comes,' he used to say, 'or it will slip away like a fish in dark water.' He had a particular fondness for Miss Clara, raised her half himself after her father, Sir Alistair's younger brother, died in India. It was understood, below stairs at least, that the Hall would come to her. But when the will was read, the proper will, drawn up by solicitors, it made no specific provision. The estate was entailed to the male line, meaning Mr. Vale, unless specific contrary disposition had been made. And Sir Alistair's writings, his marginal notes? Burned, most of them, by her ladyship's orders. Sir Alistair had a habit of jotting thoughts in his private books, philosophy, poetry, bits of memory. After his death, Lady Eugenia had them cleared away. She said— He paused, choosing his words with care. She said it was too painful to see his handwriting everywhere, like ghosts haunting every room. We spoke next with Mrs. Temple, the housekeeper, in her sitting-room, a small, comfortable space whose warmth and clutter stood in marked contrast to the formal chill of the main house. She wept in whispers as she described finding the First evidence of burning, her hands twisting a handkerchief into a rope of cotton. "It's evil, sir," she whispered, her country accent growing stronger with emotion. "I've lived in this house 40 years, since I came as a girl of 13, and I've never felt such a presence. The chapel was always a place of peace. I've gone there myself when troubles weighed heavy, said my prayers and felt the better for it. But now there's something watching, something angry. The maids won't go near it, and I can't blame them. Sarah, the parlour maid, she says she heard voices there after midnight, whispering like, but in no language she could understand." "Voices?" I interjected. "You're certain?" "So she swears, Doctor. And she's not a girl given to fancies. Steady as a rock is Sarah. Been with us 8 years, and never a moment's trouble." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook, his expression non-committal. "And the household's opinion of the succession? Do the servants favour Miss Ashwood or Mr. Vale?" Mrs. Temple hesitated, and I saw in her face the struggle between loyalty to her employer and loyalty to truth. "Miss Clara has their hearts," she said at last. "Mr. Vale, well, he's pleasant enough to your face, sir. But he's not his uncle. He talks of modernizing and efficiency, and the staff fears what that might mean. Already he's suggested at reducing the household by half, bringing in new people from London. It would be the breaking up of families, sir. People who've served together for generations." We interviewed the parlour maid, Bess, who crossed herself when the chapel was mentioned and could barely be induced to speak above a whisper, the footman who reported seeing nothing unusual during their night watches, and the groom who, with evident reluctance, confessed to having seen what he took to be the chapel ghost. This last account excited Holmes's interest considerably. The groom, a sturdy young man named Tom Fletcher, described seeing a figure in a long black coat flit from the chapel by the lich gate on the second night of the burnings, moving with a curious gliding motion that had made his blood run cold. "Like it weren't walking, sir," Fletcher said, his ruddy face gone pale at the memory. "Like it were floating just above the ground. I was checking on Starlight. She'd been colicky earlier, and I happened to glance out the stable door. There it was, black as pitch against the snow, moving toward the old garden wall." "The time?" Holmes asked sharply. "Near midnight, sir. I heard the clock strike just after." "And you pursued this apparition?" Fletcher shook his head. "Not I, sir. I'm no coward, but I'm no fool neither. I went straight to Mr. Cobbett and reported what I'd seen. He and one of the footmen went out with lanterns, but there was nothing to be found save some tracks in the snow." Holmes insisted on examining the location immediately. We walked the grounds, following the route Fletcher had indicated, and my friend subjected every inch of frozen earth to his peculiar scrutiny. Near the lich gate, that roofed gateway through which coffins are traditionally carried into the churchyard, he discovered prints of boots pressed deep into a patch of snow that had lingered in the shadow of the wall. He measured them carefully with a tape he produced from his pocket, made notes of their dimensions and pattern, and then followed their trail across the frozen lawn toward the outbuildings. The track led us directly to the gardener's shed, a small stone structure where tools were stored, and where, we discovered, a scarecrow's long black coat was drying by the stove. Within moments, Holmes had extracted a confession from one of the stable boys, a lad of perhaps 15, who stood before us, crimson with shame and terror. "I put it on, sir," the boy admitted, his voice breaking. to fright Bess, the parlour maid. She's always telling stories of witches and demons, scaring the younger maids half to death with her tales. I thought if she saw something herself, she might learn better. I never meant no harm, sir. I never knew about the burning and all that. Please, sir, don't tell her ladyship. I'll lose my place." Holmes regarded him with an expression that managed to combine severity and understanding. "You will tell Mr. Cobbett yourself, and accept whatever punishment he sees fit. You have wasted my time, and added needlessly to the fears of an already frightened household. But you have also, inadvertently, eliminated one variable from my calculations. Go now, and consider yourself fortunate that your foolishness had no graver consequences. That apparition, at least, was laid to rest. But as we returned to the house, I observed Holmes's expression, and knew that this small victory had not lessened his sense that something far more dangerous was at work. Mr. Prynne excited my suspicion more than once during those investigative hours. He hovered by the chapel like a moth drawn to flame, and spoke of monastic palimpsests and incunabula with a relish that seemed ill-suited to a house in grief. When I mentioned this to Holmes, he nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Prynne is interesting," he said, "a man of considerable learning, and I suspect considerable debt. Observe his clothing. Good quality, but worn at the cuffs and collar. His shoes have been resoled so many times that the leather of the uppers is beginning to separate. His portfolio contains sketches not only of our Psalter, but of at least a dozen other items in the house, silver, paintings, the ornamental sword in the great hall. He is cataloguing Watson in the manner of a man who intends to return with a buyer, or perhaps to recommend items for auction. Then he is a thief? Or merely an opportunist? Let us see what his sketches reveal." Through a stratagem I shall not detail, it involved a request for Prynne to show us examples of Gothic architecture in his portfolio. Holmes contrived to examine the man's papers. Within were careful sketches of the lectern and of the Psalter's binding, along with a list of dealers in Cheapside and notations of estimated values. There were also copies of entries from auction catalogues, and what appeared to be correspondence with a firm of book dealers regarding items of interest in private collections currently not on the market. "He is a scout," Holmes concluded, returning the portfolio to an oblivious Prynne. "He haunts country houses in the guise of a touring antiquarian, identifies valuable items, and either purchases them himself at below market value or steers buyers to them for a commission. Distasteful, perhaps, but not criminal, unless he has graduated from scouting to theft or destruction." Yet nothing tangible tied Prynne to the smoulder, save appetite and proximity, qualities common to far lesser crimes than arson. Holmes was forced to classify him as a person of interest, but not a primary suspect. The Reverend Brent presented a different sort of puzzle. He was above reproach in conduct, and anxious to a degree that sapped his health. I observed him taking digitalis for what I suspected was an overtaxed heart, but we could not ignore the fact of his key to the vestry. When pressed during a private interview in his modest rooms at the chaplain's lodge, he confessed with evident pain that he had once, during Sir Alister's life, witnessed the old gentleman jot a date and initials upon the Psalter's fly-leaf, with a selfish little satisfaction, as Brent described it, that gave me pain even then. "Why pain, Reverend?" Holmes asked gently. Brent's hands trembled as he set down his teacup. because Sir Alister treated books, even sacred books, as both repository and theatre. He would write in them, mark passages, argue in the margins with long-dead authors. I remonstrated with him once, suggested that the Psalter at least should be kept pure, free from personal annotation. He laughed, not unkindly, you understand, and said that a book unwritten in was a book unlived with. But I feared that important legal documents might be hidden thus, mingled with prayers and scriptures, where they might be damaged or lost. And did you, perhaps, attempt to preserve such documents? To make copies? The Reverend's face flushed crimson. I did take a rubbing once, Mr. Holmes. After Sir Alister's death, when the question of the codicil arose, I remembered seeing writing in the Psalter. I used the old technique, a soft pencil over thin paper, to try to recover what had been written, but the page was already damaged, scraped somehow, and I could make out only fragments. I have the rubbing still in my study, if you wish to see it. Holmes did wish to see it, and within the hour we stood in the Reverend's cramped study, a room lined with theological works and smelling of pipe tobacco and leather, examining a sheet of thin paper upon which faint markings could be discerned. Through my medical lens, I could make out what appeared to be codicil, Ashwood Hall to Clara Ashwood, followed by initials and a date. "This is evidence, Reverend," Holmes said quietly. "Why did you not bring it forward immediately?" "Because I feared it would be dismissed as forgery or fantasy," Brent replied miserably. "A rubbing is not the original. Anyone could claim I had manufactured it to support Miss Clara's cause. I prayed, that the original markings might yet be recovered, that the burning might be stopped before the evidence was destroyed entirely." We dined that evening amid a silence that did no honour to the excellent dishes Mrs. Temple's kitchen had produced. The long mahogany table could have seated 20. But our party of 8, Lady Eugenia at the head, Miss Ashwood and myself on one side, Holmes, Mr. Vale, and the Reverend on the other, with Mr. Prynne at the foot, seemed lost in its expanse. The candles in their silver branches cast more shadows than light, and I found myself watching those shadows flicker against the panelled walls like living things. Lady Eugenia presided with a composure I could not help but admire. She had that quality I used to see in women who had nursed men through war, the art of drawing a veil across her own inward motion, presenting to the world only what the world required to see. She guided conversations with skill, touching upon neutral topics, the weather, the prospects for spring planting, a recent exhibition at the Royal Academy, and deflecting with grace any remarks that threatened to veer toward dangerous ground. Only once did her composure falter. When conversation, by the natural malice of chance, turned to fires, Mr. Prynne, in an ill-judged moment, began describing the great conflagration of a 1780 that had consumed much of the old village and licked at the park's outer wall. Lady Eugenia set her wine-glass down with too abrupt a movement. A pearl of claret leapt the rim and spread upon the white damask like a wound. She stared at it for a moment with an expression I could not read, then dabbed at it with her napkin while apologizing for her clumsiness. But I had seen her hand tremble, and I had seen in her eyes something that might have been fear, or might have been guilt, or perhaps that peculiar compound of both which marks those who have done wrong for what they believe to be right reasons. After dinner, Holmes made a request that surprised me. "I should like to see the sewing-room, if I may," he said to Lady Eugenia. I understand it was a favourite retreat of Sir Alister's late sister, and I am curious about the domestic arrangements of the house." Lady Eugenia looked puzzled, but acquiesced, and we were shown by Mrs. Temple to a bright, pretty chamber at the top of the west stair. It was a feminine space, strewn with tambour frames and baskets of coloured wool, where the late winter light would stream through south-facing windows in the mornings. Fire had been laid but not lit, and the room held that peculiar chill of spaces that are maintained but rarely occupied. Holmes moved through it with the systematic thoroughness of a customs inspector, examining the work baskets, the skeins of thread organised by colour, the half-finished embroideries stretched on their frames. Upon a side table he found a little tray of wax cakes for treating thread, small discs of refined beeswax, some coloured, some plain, each no larger than a shilling piece. And then, with a soft exclamation of triumph, he seized upon what he had clearly been seeking: a tiny glassine envelope, empty, bearing the label of a chemist in Cheapside. The envelope was of the sort used for powders that must be kept free from moisture, translucent, waxed paper that crackled faintly when touched. "Mr. Prynne's district," I murmured, thinking of the book scouts' connections to that area of London. "Cheapside sells many things to many persons, Watson," Holmes returned, holding the envelope to the light. "But the glassine is near cousin to those used for powders that do not love the open air. Photographic chemicals, pharmaceutical preparations, and certain compounds of phosphorus which must be kept sealed lest they oxidize prematurely." "Then the culprit is a lady?" I said, startled by the implication. The sewing-room was clearly a feminine domain. Holmes smiled, that thin smile, which meant I had stated the obvious while missing the essential. "My dear fellow," he said, "culprits, like saints, answer to neither gender nor station. Let us call this for now a thread, a literal one if you glance beneath." He indicated, with the tip of his long finger, a blue silk filament caught beneath the little tray. Using his tweezers, he extracted it carefully and held it to the light. It was finest quality silk embroidery thread, dyed a particular shade of blue that I had seen before. "Where?" I asked. "Lady Eugenia's embroidery frame, in the drawing-room. She has been working on a fire screen, I believe, a pattern of lilies in just this shade." From that moment, Holmes made the vestry his haunt. He arranged with Cobbett to have a screen placed in the shadows, behind which he could observe without being observed. He positioned himself there at intervals throughout the day and evening, watching with that infinite patience which is perhaps his most remarkable quality. I joined him twice, sitting in the cold dimness while the household went about its business, and I confess the vigil tried my nerves severely. Twice servants came to pray and fled almost immediately, their nerves unable to sustain the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Once the Reverend Brent sat a full hour with his face buried in his hands, and I heard him weeping softly, the exhausted tears of a man pushed beyond his emotional resources. A young housemaid brought flowers and arranged them with trembling hands before fleeing as though pursued. Mr. Prynne appeared once, made as if to examine the Psalter, then seemed to think better of it, and withdrew. Toward dusk of the second day, a dusk that came early and grey, pressing against the narrow windows like a physical force, the air in the chapel took on that peculiar thickness which I had learned to associate with catastrophe. The shadows lengthened and seemed to deepen beyond what the failing light could account for. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck, and beside me I sensed Holmes's sudden alertness, the coiling of his entire being into a posture of readiness. Then, at last, a figure entered softly through the vestry door, a woman in a dark mantle, hood drawn over her features, hands bare and pale in the gloom. She moved with the certainty of familiarity, mounting the lectern step with barely a sound, setting a candle well aside upon the window ledge, and then, with the lightest pressure of her fingers, turning back the Psalter's leaves until Psalm 141 lay open like a wound. Holmes motioned me to absolute stillness, his hand on my arm iron-hard in its urgency. We watched as the woman glanced swiftly about, her profile just visible in the candle's glow. I saw one small hand go to her pocket and draw forth a minute folded paper. She unfolded it with infinite care, hesitated as though gathering courage, and at that instant Holmes's arm shot out, and he stepped from behind the screen in a single fluid motion. In 3 swift strides he stood between her and the book, and the paper, fallen from her startled fingers, skated across the ancient stone floor. She did not cry out. She did not swoon. She stood very straight and looked my friend full in the face, with an expression of weary resignation. "Lady Eugenia," said Holmes quietly, and bowed with a courtesy that somehow made the moment more terrible than any accusation could have done. It was a picture I shall not forget. The gentleman detective with the candle ring of light upon his sharp cheek, the pale lady caught between piety and purpose, and the hateful little scorch marks, mute and obscene, along the margin of the sacred page. Outside, I heard the wind rise in the cedars, and from somewhere distant came the sound of the stable clock striking 6, a sound that seemed to mark not merely the hour, but the end of some chapter in the history of Ashwood Hall. In that moment, the case ripened like fruit in sudden sun. To what harvest it would come, I could not yet say. But I knew, with the certainty with which a man knows the turn of his own heartbeat, that the next hours would test not only Holmes's cunning, but also his mercy. That quality which, though he would deny possessing it, I had seen him exercise more than once when justice and compassion found themselves at odds. Chapter 4. Holmes's Experiment and the Hidden Hand. Holmes never accused where a demonstration would persuade. It was a principle he had stated to me many times, that the guilty, confronted with incontrovertible evidence, will confess more readily than when faced with mere accusation, and that the innocent deserve the courtesy of proof rather than presumption. He lifted the fallen paper with his forceps, those slender tongs he carried for handling evidence, examined it briefly by the candle's light, and smiled that fleeting private smile which meant the last piece of the puzzle had found its place in the pattern. Then, without a word of accusation or explanation, he drew from his pocket a plain 12mo volume, one of his own notebooks, as it happened, bound in brown paper and unmarked, and laid it where the Psalter had lain upon the lectern. "You will indulge me, Lady Eugenia," he said in a tone of perfect courtesy, as though requesting permission to demonstrate a parlour trick rather than exposing a crime. A parable in chemistry, if you will. I find that the language of science often speaks more clearly than the language of law. From another pocket, my friend's coat was a marvel of concealed compartments, like a conjurer's apparatus. He produced a tiny stoppered bottle of dark glass, a camel hair brush of the sort artists use for the finest detail work, and a pinch of powder wrapped in waxed paper. Lady Eugenia stood motionless, her face gone white as marble. but she neither protested nor attempted to flee. There was in her stillness something of the dignity of a soldier awaiting the court-martial's verdict. With deft strokes, Holmes painted a thin line along the notebook's foredge, the brush leaving barely visible traces against the brown paper. He closed the book with care, waited perhaps 30 seconds, and then opened it to the middle pages. The line, now invisible to casual inspection, was nowhere to be seen upon the paper's surface. "Observe, Watson," he said, though his words were clearly meant for Lady Eugenia as well. "White phosphorus, when thinned with gum arabic and mixed with chalk or starch, can be applied as a liquid suspension. Once dry, it becomes nearly invisible, especially upon aged paper or cloth. But it retains its essential nature, its hunger for oxygen, its readiness to ignite." He then took the candle from the window ledge and held it not to the page itself, but near the book's inner hinge, at a distance of perhaps 3 inches. For a moment nothing happened. Then a slow thread of smoke wound upward from the pages, white and acrid. Presently there flared, at some distance from the candle's flame itself, a keen, steady tongue of fire which marched along the edge like a lit fuse, consuming the line Holmes had painted, with a small, eager flame that burned with surprising intensity before guttering out, leaving a brown scorch mark upon the paper. "It is not a ghost that haunts your chapel, Lady Eugenia," Holmes said coolly, setting the candle aside and closing the notebook upon its damaged page. "It is white phosphorus, thinned and preserved with gum and chalk, in a suspension that allows it to be painted upon paper. It ignites upon warmth and exposure to air. The margin of the Psalter at Psalm 141 has been so treated, not once, but multiple times. Someone who desired to make a curse of a very human intention has applied it repeatedly, scraping first with a blade to efface what a pen once set there, and afterwards calling upon superstition to complete the work of a knife, while the household looked on in terror." I was watching Lady Eugenia's face. In her features I saw not fear, but exhaustion, the terrible relief of a woman who has fought a pitched battle under cover of night and now understands that day has come, and her position can no longer be held. Her shoulders, which she had held so straight, sagged slightly, and she reached out one hand to steady herself against the lectern. "What was on the fallen paper?" I whispered to Holmes as he bent to retrieve it with his forceps, though I suspected I already knew. "A shopping list," he returned, showing it to me. "Thread wax, glassine envelopes, and, more telling than either, a rat paste whose principal virtue is phosphorus, sold under the brand name Vermin's Bane. The Cheapside chemist's label you admired upstairs in the sewing-room has a sister here, and both match purchases made by a messenger, a boy from the village, who was paid handsomely to make the journey to London and ask no questions. I visited the chemist this morning, Watson, while you were at breakfast. He remembered the order quite clearly. It was unusual for a country household to purchase such exotic items by proxy." Lady Eugenia spoke then, her voice low but perfectly controlled. "You are very thorough, Mr. Holmes, too thorough for the likes of me. I'm not a criminal by nature or by practice. I am simply a mother who saw her child's inheritance threatened and acted—" She paused, searching for the word. "Acted in haste and in error." "We shall speak more plainly in company," Holmes replied. "I believe the full household should hear what has transpired. But first, Lady Eugenia, I must ask you, is there any more of this preparation remaining? Any further danger to the book or to those who might handle it?" "No," she said wearily. "What you see is the last. I had intended to finish the work tonight, to complete the destruction, so that no trace of the codicil could ever be recovered. But I find I lack the courage. I have not slept properly in a fortnight, Mr. Holmes. Every night I see my late husband's face. Imagine his disappointment. He was a good man, a kind man. He would be ashamed of what I have done." "Then let us see if we can yet salvage some honor from dishonor," Holmes said gently. "Come." We assembled the household in the long gallery, that formal space where portraits of Ashwood ancestors gazed down from the walls with expressions of perpetual judgment. The late winter evening had drawn in fully now, and the servants had lit candles in sconces along the walls, creating pools of warm light that seemed only to deepen the shadows between. Mr. Vale was there, affecting an air of injured astonishment which sat ill upon his handsome features. The Reverend Brent, pale and shaking, his hands clasped before him as though in prayer. Mr. Prynne, alight with that horrid curiosity which marks the spectator at disaster. Miss Ashwood, her face carefully composed, but her eyes red from recent weeping. And the senior servants, Cobbett, Mrs. Temple, and 2 of the footmen, ranged behind like a chorus in some Greek tragedy. Holmes had earlier sent me, under the pretence of a misplaced stethoscope, to the Reverend's study, where, following his precise directions, I had found a folded paper tucked within the spine of an old service book on the topmost shelf. It was the rubbing the Reverend had mentioned, clumsy but legible, showing the faint impression of writing. Codicil. Ashwood Hall, to Clara Ashwood, my niece, upon my death. I revoke all prior dispositions contrary to this wish. A.A. September 15th, 1884. The inked hand, though rendered imperfectly by the rubbing technique, was unmistakably that of a gentleman of education, and the date matched precisely with Sir Alister's final illness. This document now rested in Holmes's pocket as he mounted the situation with that mingled suavity and rigour which made him, in such moments, the inevitable master of any room. He stood where the winter light from the tall windows, thin as milk, grey as dishwater, fell upon his lean features, and he addressed them in a tone that held neither triumph nor pity, but only the clean edge of fact. "Lady Eugenia," he began, his eyes resting upon her with an expression I could not quite read, "your first thought was for your son. This much is clear, and this much I do not condemn. The instinct to protect one's child is among the most powerful in nature. You knew, or believed, that Sir Alister had appended to the Psalter a codicil which disinherited Mr. Vale in favour of Miss Ashwood. You had access to 3 keys in this house, your own, Mr. Cobbett's, and the Reverend's. You knew the habits of the household, the patterns of the watch, the hours when the chapel stood empty. You considered that to scrape and burn was simpler than to fight a suit in Chancery. Less public, less costly, less cruel to all involved. Mr. Vale sprang forward, his face flushed with indignation. This is monstrous. My aunt is a lady of unblemished character. You cannot. Peace, Julian, Lady Eugenia said quietly, and there was in her voice such authority that her nephew subsided immediately, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Holmes continued as though there had been no interruption. Your wax, beeswax, scented for treating embroidery. Thread fell upon the vestry latch on a night of haste. A small thing, but significant. The glassine envelopes, purchased in Cheapside through a messenger whose name I shall not publish here, to spare him further entanglement in this affair, served to carry the phosphorus powder whose scent has lingered in the chapel and in the sewing-room where you prepared your incendiary suspension. You applied it carefully, using a fine brush, to the margins of Psalm 141, knowing that the Reverend would open to that page for the morning service, knowing that the candles and incense would provide the warmth necessary for ignition. But the scraping, I interjected, the knife marks Holmes found, when were those made? Earlier, Holmes replied, perhaps days or weeks before the burning began. Lady Eugenia first attempted to remove the codicil mechanically, using a sharp blade to scrape away the ink. But Sir Alistair wrote with a good India ink, permanent and penetrating, and the words, though damaged, remained partially legible. The burning was meant to complete what the blade could not accomplish, to destroy the evidence so thoroughly that not even the faintest trace would remain. He turned to Mr. Vale, and his tone grew sharper. Sir, your boots, twice resoled with the oblong patch, which I noted on our first day here, left prints in the nave on the second night of the burnings. You wished the ghost to be taken for a man, to deflect suspicion from your aunt. It was a child's trick, and it succeeded only with the children and the more credulous servants. Your mother sought to protect you. You, in turn, sought to protect her, adding confusion to what was already a tangled skein. Vale's face had gone from red to white. I merely walked the chapel, Mr. Holmes. I was concerned. There is no crime in that. None whatever. But there is foolishness in leaving evidence where a trained observer might find it. Holmes then addressed Mr. Prynne, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to alarm. As for you, Mr. Prynne, your sketches and your appetite are alike indelicate. You have been cataloguing the valuables of this house in the hope of brokering their sale, preying upon a family in distress. Had you touched one page of that Psalter without leave, had you attempted to remove or purchase it, I should have had you thrown from the step by Mr. Cobbett and his footman. But your crimes are venial rather than mortal, distasteful opportunism rather than malicious destruction. I trust you will remove yourself from Ashwood before sunset tomorrow. Prynne opened his mouth as if to protest, met Holmes's gaze, and thought better of it. He bowed stiffly and retreated to the rear of the assembly. Reverend Brent, Holmes continued, his tone softening, your anguish does you credit. Your studies rubbing, taken when hope at last convinced you the codicil must once have existed, will stand a judge's scrutiny when we lay the original beside it. You sought to preserve evidence, not to destroy it. In this matter, your conscience may rest easy. The original, Miss Ashwood breathed, speaking for the first time. You mean the codicil still exists? Holmes's eyes warmed with one of those rare transformations that revealed the essential humanity beneath his often cold exterior. I did not come to Ashwood to watch a book burn, Miss Ashwood. Last night, very late, while the house slept and the footmen dozed at their posts, for which I do not blame them. It was cold and tedious work. I entered the vestry by means I shall not detail. I removed the page in question with infinite care, steaming open the binding and separating the leaf so gently that no tear was made. In its place, I positioned a duplicate page, a blank sheet from an old Psalter I keep among my references in Baker Street, aged artificially with tea and smoke to match the original. That page would have scorched to cinders under less gentle fingers than those of her ladyship. The true leaf, gently lifted along the very furrow our culprit's knife had begun, is quite safe in my dispatch box at the inn where Dr. Watson and I have been lodging. A murmur travelled through the gallery like wind through reeds. Lady Eugenia swayed, and Cobbett sprang forward with a chair, which she sank into with a grace that somehow made the moment more painful rather than less. She sat very still for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, before speaking. "My son," she said, in a voice low and very even, addressing Julian directly, "is young, and has known little but comfort. He has never wanted, never struggled, never seen the wolf at the door that I knew in my own youth. I did not choose for myself, I chose for him. I convinced myself that Miss Clara, being a woman, would eventually marry and require only a modest settlement, while Julian, the male heir, the bearer of the Ashwood name, required the estate to maintain his position in society. Yet her voice caught for just an instant. I did this. Mr. Holmes, I will say nothing in my defence, except that I thought the law would be a butcher to us all, that litigation would consume what remained of Sir Alister's fortune, and leave everyone beggared." Holmes inclined his head with something approaching respect. "The law can be a surgeon when it will, madam, cutting cleanly when it must. I am not your judge. That role belongs to others. But I will observe that no life has been lost, no person injured, and no irreparable harm done, which is a mercy you may cherish. What remains is to set the truth before those whose business it is to weigh such matters and determine what justice requires." He signalled me with a small gesture. From my bag I drew the folded leaf, which Holmes had entrusted to my care that morning. It was a delicate operation, that restoration. The thin paper, yellowed with age and softened by the binding's pressure. The dried strip of paste, laid earlier at Holmes's, meticulous instruction, which would unite it once more to its fellows in the book. The hand upon the margin, firm, impatient, generous in its loops and flourishes, seemed almost to speak as we stood there in the candlelight. I do not deny that for a moment every person in that room bent forward as if a ghost had indeed spoken. The codicil was brief but clear. Sir Alister had written in a strong hand that Ashwood Hall should pass to Clara Ashwood, revoking all prior dispositions, and had signed with his initials and the date. It was witnessed by a notation in different ink and a smaller hand, the Reverend Brent's signature, added, as he now confirmed with trembling voice, at Sir Alister's request on the afternoon before his death. "It is legal," Holmes said quietly. "I have consulted by telegram with a solicitor of my acquaintance. A holograph codicil, properly witnessed, has the force of law. The family must now determine how to proceed, whether through litigation or through settlement. We left them so, a household held in the long hands of consequence, gathered in that portrait-lined gallery while the candles burned lower and the shadows deepened. Lady Eugenia sat still as stone in her chair, her composure intact, but her eyes ancient with sorrow. Mr. Vale stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Miss Ashwood had crossed the room and now knelt beside Lady Eugenia's chair, taking her hand, a gesture of forgiveness, or at least of understanding, that spoke better of her character than any words could have done. I confess I slept poorly that night, despite the comfortable bed at our inn and the knowledge that the case was essentially solved. It is not always the villain who rouses one's conscience. Sometimes it is the brave, erring heart which, having gone a pace too far in defense of what it loves, turns and accepts the blow with dignity. Chapter 5. The Gathering and the Last Word. Our final act was played at noon the following day, with the light more honest and the air less damp. The morning had brought a change in the weather. The fog had lifted, and a pale sun shone through breaks in the cloud, illuminating Ashwood Hall with a clarity that seemed symbolic. At Holmes's request, and with Lady Eugenia's consent, the principal persons assembled once more in the long gallery. Holmes likes an audience at the moment of synthesis, not from vanity, though I will not claim him entirely free of that vice, but from pedagogy. He believes, and has said to me many times, that men and women accept truth more readily when they have seen it grow from seed to flower, when each step of reasoning has been made plain and every alternative possibility eliminated. It is one of his gifts, the ability to transform the dry recitation of facts into something approaching narrative, to make the audience feel they are participants in discovery rather than passive recipients of pronouncement. He began with the evidence, arranging it before them with that patient, almost tender fashion which makes even the humblest observer feel the court has admitted them as equals. Upon a table he had set out, the Psalter itself opened to the scarred page of Psalm 141, the tiny glass vial containing the phosphorus preparation he had mixed for his demonstration, the glassine envelope from the sewing room, a sample of the beeswax from Lady Eugenia's thread tray, the Reverend's rubbing, and the recovered leaf with Sir Alister's marginal codicil, now restored to its place in the binding. "Let us begin with chemistry," Holmes said, assuming that professorial tone which always marked his explanations. White phosphorus, one of several allotropes of that element, has the peculiar property of igniting spontaneously at temperatures between 30 and 40 degrees Celsius when exposed to air. In its pure state, it is dangerous to handle, burning the skin and producing toxic fumes. But when mixed with gum arabic and a filler such as chalk or starch, it can be rendered into a paste or suspension that is safer to work with while retaining its incendiary properties. He held up the vial. "This preparation, which I created yesterday as a demonstration, contains approximately 1 part phosphorus to 10 parts gum and filler. When painted upon paper and allowed to dry, it becomes nearly invisible, especially upon aged or textured surfaces. But it retains its fundamental characteristic. It will oxidize and ignite when warmed above its kindling point." He gestured to the Psalter. The liturgical setting was chosen with care. Psalm 141 speaks of incense rising like prayer. Thus, every service guaranteed the presence of flame, warmth, and witnesses who would attribute the burning to supernatural rather than chemical causes. The thurifer's censer, the candles brought close for reading in dim light, even the warmth of hands turning. Pages, any of these could provide sufficient heat to trigger combustion. Miss Ashwood spoke, her voice carrying clearly, though she remained seated. But why not simply remove the page entirely? Why this elaborate charade of burning? "An excellent question," Holmes replied, with an approving nod. "The answer speaks to the psychology of our culprit. Lady Eugenia is not by nature a deceiver. She is a woman of conscience who convinced herself that an evil means might serve a good end. Simply removing or destroying the page would have been theft, conscious and deliberate. But to arrange matters so that the page destroyed itself, so that supernatural forces appeared to intervene. This allowed her to maintain a fiction of innocence, to tell herself that fate, not her own hand, was erasing the evidence. He picked up the glassine envelope, turning it so the light caught the waxed paper. This envelope, and I have confirmed with the Cheapside chemist, was sold as part of an order that included thread wax, embroidery supplies, and a preparation marketed as vermin's bane. This last is advertised as a rat poison, though its primary ingredient is phosphorus. The order was placed by a village boy acting as messenger, paid a generous sum to make the journey, and ask no questions. The chemist remembered it, because country orders for such items are unusual. Mrs. Temple, standing with the other servants, spoke hesitantly. "But, ma'am, her ladyship, she's not one who would know about chemicals and such. Begging pardon, but where would she learn of such things?" Holmes's expression softened slightly. "An astute observation, Mrs. Temple. Lady Eugenia, before her marriage, was Miss Eugenia Hartwell, daughter of a country apothecary in Yorkshire. She grew up in her father's shop, learning the properties of compounds and preparations. She would have known that phosphorus, properly handled, could achieve what she desired. She had the knowledge, the opportunity, and, as she perceived it, the necessity." He then addressed the matter of access with systematic precision. 3 keys existed to the vestry, one held by Mr. Cobbett, one by the Reverend Brent, and one by Lady Eugenia herself. The watchers posted after the first burning were conscientious but not infallible. A lady of the house, the widow of the late master, moving quietly through her own home in the hours before dawn. Who would question her? Who would think to stop her? Cobbett bowed his head, his face expressing the shame of one who feels he has failed in his duty. "I should have thought, Mr. Holmes. I should have suspected." "You should have suspected your mistress of arson and deception." Holmes's tone was gentle. "No, Mr. Cobbett. You did your duty as your training and your loyalty dictated. The fault, such as it was, lay not in your vigilance, but in the very structure of trust upon which households are built." He moved on to dispose of the various red herrings with a briskness that I confess I admired, for each in turn had seemed significant in its moment. The ghost glimpsed by the groom, Fletcher, was young Tom in a scarecrow's coat, seeking to frighten the superstitious Bess, a foolish prank that unfortunately added to the household's terror. Mr. Vale's midnight wanderings in the chapel, leaving his distinctive boot prints, were motivated by concern for his mother. He had guessed at her involvement, or at least suspected it, and sought to create confusion and alternative suspects. It was loyalty, however misguided, not malice. Vale's face coloured, but he said nothing, his hand still resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. "Mr. Prynne's designs," Holmes continued, his gaze resting on the book scout with evident distaste, "were upon scholarship and commerce, not upon pocket directly. He is what is known in the trade as a runner, one who identifies valuable items in private collections and steers buyers toward them for a commission. His portfolio contained sketches of 12 items from this house, each with estimated values. Loathsome in timing and taste, perhaps, but not criminal unless he had proceeded to theft, which he had not. Prynne had already packed his bags, I noted, and they stood by the gallery door, a silent admission that Ashwood would see him no more. "The Reverend's rubbing," Holmes said, picking up that fragile sheet with care, "was an act of desperation, born of hope and grief. He sought to preserve what he feared would be lost, to create evidence where the original was threatened. In a court of law, this rubbing would be viewed as hearsay, as a copy without authentication. But when laid beside the original, he placed the two side by side, the rubbing and the recovered page. We see that every stroke, every letter, corresponds exactly. The rubbing is honest, and the Reverend's conscience may rest easy. Brent's eyes filled with tears, and he bowed his head. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God." Holmes then turned his full attention to Lady Eugenia, who had sat throughout in perfect stillness, her composure unbroken, though the weight of exposure and shame must have been nearly unbearable. "Madam," he said, and his tone held something I had rarely heard from him. Not quite sympathy, but a recognition of shared humanity, of the complex motives that drive people to actions they would never have imagined themselves capable of committing. "You have two courts to face, the one at Guildford, where the matter of the codicil will be decided, and the one in your own breast, where the sentence has already been passed. The first will take evidence and make determinations according to law. The second has already rendered its verdict. I see it in your face, in your sleepless nights, in the tremor that you can no longer quite conceal. I will, with Miss Ashwood's leave, place the leaf and the rubbing in the hands of the family's solicitor, and urge a settlement that spares all of you the more sordid blows of litigation. The law exists to do justice, not to punish beyond what justice requires." All eyes turned to Miss Ashwood. The young woman rose, and I was struck by the transformation in her bearing. The frightened, trembling figure who had appeared in our Baker Street lodgings 2 days prior had been replaced by someone who had discovered reserves of strength she perhaps had not known she possessed. "I will accept such a settlement," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the gallery. "That preserves for Lady Eugenia a life interest in the rooms she has occupied these 20 years, with an allowance sufficient to maintain her dignity and comfort. I will accept a settlement that secures for Julian an income worthy of the Ashwood name and sufficient to establish him in a profession, contingent upon his making something of himself beyond the drawing-rooms of London. The estate itself I will take in hand, not to change what my uncle built, but to preserve it for the next generation." There was no triumph in her voice, only a calm which, by its very absence of rancour, placed everyone else under a kind of debt. It was the voice of someone who understood that victory without grace is no victory at all, and that a house divided against itself cannot long stand. Mr. Vale, to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, I leave that judgment to posterity, bowed deeply to his cousin. "I accept your terms," he said, his voice unsteady. "And I beg your pardon, Clara. I allowed my mother's fears to cloud my judgment. I should have trusted in the law and in justice." Lady Eugenia did not weep. She rose from her chair with the careful precision of one whose body is held together by will alone, and she crossed to Miss Ashwood. For a long moment the two women looked at one another, the elder who had tried to rob the younger of her inheritance, and the younger who held the power to destroy or to save. Then Lady Eugenia kissed Miss Ashwood once upon the brow, a gesture that seemed to combine blessing and surrender, apology and gratitude. "Your uncle chose well," she said softly. "You have his heart, Clara. I hope you will forgive me some day, though I know I do not deserve it. There is nothing to forgive that has not already been forgiven," Miss Ashwood replied, and I believed her. In that moment I saw in her something of the best of English character, the capacity for mercy without weakness, for judgment without cruelty. Lady Eugenia withdrew upon Mr. Cobbett's arm, moving with the air of a queen who has laid down a crown that cut her temples. The butler's face was set in lines of stern compassion. He would serve her still, I thought, as he had served for 30 years. But something between them had changed forever. The assembly dispersed gradually, servants returning to their duties, Mr. Prynne departing with his bags and his portfolio, and without farewells. The Reverend Brent remained, speaking quietly with Miss Ashwood about the arrangements for a memorial service for Sir Alistair, a proper observance that the confusion and grief had prevented before now. Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the chapel, standing before the lectern where the Psalter lay restored, the recovered page in its rightful place, the scorch marks along its margin a permanent reminder of what had transpired. In the coloured light from the stained glass window, the words of Psalm 141 seemed to glow. "Let my prayer be set forth before thee as incense, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." Incense indeed, I murmured, but of a kind David never imagined. "The psalm continues," Holmes said quietly, his finger tracing the verses below the damaged section. "Keep the door of my lips. Incline not my heart to any evil thing." Sound advice, which our Lady Eugenia would have done well to heed. "You were merciful with her, Holmes. I have seen you less forgiving of crimes, less motivated by love." He turned to face me, and in his grey eyes I saw that complex mixture of reason and feeling which made him, for all his protestations of being merely a calculating machine, fundamentally human. "Love does not excuse, Watson, but it explains. Lady Eugenia is not a Lady Macbeth, urging murder for ambition's sake. She is a mother who saw her child's future threatened and acted as mothers have acted since time immemorial. Rashly, perhaps, wrongly, certainly, but from an impulse as old as life itself. The law will have its say. But I see no virtue in adding unnecessary cruelty to necessary justice." It was later, when the train had drawn us out of Surrey, and the smoke of Ashwood's chimneys had faded into a single grey line against the pale sky, that Holmes at last relaxed into his seat in our first-class compartment, and allowed himself the indulgence of reflection. The winter landscape slid past our window, bare trees, frozen fields, the occasional cottage with smoke rising from its chimney into the still air. London lay ahead, with all its noise and urgency. But for this hour we existed in the peculiar suspension of railway travel, neither here nor there, in a space that invited contemplation. "You are lenient, Holmes," I observed, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between us. "It is not your habit to soften the blade where crime is concerned." He smiled faintly, that barely there expression which meant he was weighing whether to share his thoughts or keep them private. After a moment, he spoke. "When steel meets flesh, Watson, one learns to judge by the wound. There are crimes which bruise the body politic and must be cauterized without mercy. Murders, betrayals, acts of malice that poison the very fabric of society. These I pursue with all the rigor at my command. But there are others which spring from that very warmth by which a house is kept alive, from love twisted into fear, from loyalty pressed into desperate action. Lady Eugenia lit a cruel fire, but she did so to bar what she perceived as a colder fate. It is not for me to praise or condemn her motives, only to point to the tinder and to the hand that struck it. The judgment of her soul I leave to a higher court than mine." He took from his pocket the smallest scrap of paper, the shopping list we had recovered, that humble inventory of thread wax and poisons that had served as the blueprint for deception. With one of his lucifers he set it alight, and we watched as it curled upon itself, consumed in a bright instant, and fell to ash upon the brass tray that served our compartment for such purposes. "See, Watson," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the dying ember, "how eager flame is to obey the least invitation. A conscience is the only tinder that needs no match. Lady Eugenia's will burn for the remainder of her days, whatever disposition the law makes of her case. That is punishment enough, I think." I considered his words as the train rattled on toward London. In the gathering dusk, the lamps inside our compartment came alive, casting warm circles of light that held back the darkness beyond the windows. I thought of Ashwood Hall, of Lady Eugenia and Miss Ashwood, of the Psalter with its scarred pages bearing witness to human frailty and human grace in equal measure. And the codicil? You believe Miss Ashwood will honour her promise of a settlement? I do. She has her uncle's character. Generous but not weak, just but not cruel. Ashwood Hall will be better for her stewardship, I think. As for Mr. Vale, whether he makes something of himself or fritters away his allowance in London clubs remains to be seen. Youth is capable of surprising transformations, for better or for worse. And Lady Eugenia? Holmes was silent for a long moment. She will live with what she has done. She will find, perhaps, that her son's comfort is less warming than she imagined when it comes at such a price. Or perhaps she will justify it to herself, convince herself that she acted rightly, though the world judged her wrong. That is the peculiar blessing and curse of conscience, Watson. It is the one judge from whom there is no appeal. That night, back in our Baker Street lodgings, the fire on our own hearth burned with a docile, homely cheer. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a late supper, cold chicken and bread, with a bottle of decent claret, which we consumed in the comfortable silence of men who have completed a difficult task and survived with their partnership intact. Holmes took up his violin afterward and played softly, nothing I recognized, simply weaving phrases and melodies that seemed to rise from the instrument without conscious direction. I set down the final notes of the case in my journal, my pen scratching across the page in the familiar rhythm of narrative. As I wrote the last lines and closed the book, I felt that peculiar quiet which comes when a wound has been cleaned. The pain not gone, but honestly borne. The healing begun, though. Completion lies far ahead. "What will you call it?" Holmes asked from his chair, the violin now silent across his lap. "Call it? When you publish it, Watson. You will publish it. You always do, despite my protestations. What lurid title will you give this little affair?" I smiled, knowing he was not truly displeased. For all his complaints about my sensationalizing his cases, I had long suspected he took a private pleasure in seeing them recorded and preserved. I thought perhaps the adventure of the Burning Psalter. Simple, direct, and suggestive of the mystery without revealing the solution. "Biblical," he commented. "The reading public does love a touch of scripture with their crime." "Very well. But do me the favor, Watson, of emphasizing the chemistry. Let it be understood that what burned at Ashwood was not the wrath of God, but the malice of man, aided by the properties of phosphorus. We have superstition enough in this world without adding to the stock. I shall make it clear, I assured him, though I confess there was something almost supernatural about the atmosphere of that chapel. The shadows, the silence, the sense of watching eyes. All of which, Holmes interrupted with a touch of asperity, can be explained by the power of suggestion working upon minds prepared by rumour and fear. There are no ghosts, Watson, save those we create in our own imaginations. The only hauntings at Ashwood were the hauntings of guilt and grief, and those are potent enough without invoking spectres from beyond the grave. Yet even as he spoke, I thought I detected in his voice the faintest uncertainty, as though he too had felt something in that cold stone chapel that resisted easy explanation. But Holmes would never admit to such a weakness, and I knew better than to press the point. The fire burned lower, the coals settling with soft whispers and occasional pops. Beyond our windows, London carried on its ceaseless business, the rattle of late cabs, the distant sound of a policeman's whistle, the perpetual urban symphony that was our familiar backdrop. We were home, returned from Surrey and its mysteries to the known quantities of Baker Street. And yet I knew, as I prepared for bed that night, that Ashwood Hall would remain with me. The grey stone and the yew trees, the scarred Psalter, and the faces of those caught in that drama of inheritance and desperation. I would remember Lady Eugenia's composure in the face of exposure, Miss Ashwood's unexpected grace, and Holmes's mercy tempered with justice. But most of all, I would remember that small, hungry flame dancing along the margin of sacred words, and Holmes's quiet observation that conscience is the only tinder that needs no match. It was a truth that burned brighter than any phosphorus, and one that would illuminate the dark corners of memory long after the case itself had faded into the archives of Baker Street's resolved mysteries. Thus ended the curious affair of the burning Psalter, not with fire and destruction, as it might have done, but with restoration and reconciliation. In a world that often seemed bent on tearing itself apart, it was a small victory for reason and compassion. And as I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking that if we could approach all our human conflicts with such clarity and such mercy, the world might be a somewhat warmer place, even in the depths of February's cold. The foregoing account has been compiled from my notes and published with the permission of the parties involved, their names and certain identifying details having been altered to preserve their privacy. Sir Alister's Psalter remains at Ashwood Chapel, its scarred page a reminder that even the most sacred texts must sometimes bear witness to human frailty. The codicil was honoured, the settlement reached, and Ashwood Hall prospers under Miss Ashwood's stewardship to this day. H.W., Baker Street, London, 1886.